Welcome to today's lesson on comparing decimals to fractions. Today I'm going to teach you how to convert a decimal into a fraction and a fraction into a decimal so that you can compare them to see which one is less than, greater than, or equal to the other. Let's go ahead and get started. We are going to begin today comparing 38 tenths and 3 9/10. Now I want you to remember that decimals and fractions can both represent the same value. They're just two different ways of writing a number. So let's go ahead and start with 38 tenths. I'm going to draw out 38 tenths. So as you can see, I've shaded in 10 tenths, 20 tenths, 30 tenths, and then 8 tenths. And that pretty clearly tells us that we have 3 wholes and 8 tenths. Now I'm going to shade in 3 9/10 written as a decimal. I have 3 wholes shaded in, and then I have 9/10 shaded in. So now we're ready to compare our fraction with our decimal. Now using our visuals, it's pretty clear to see that they both have the same value of wholes, which is 3 wholes. But when we get to our part of the whole, which is our decimal or a fraction, 9/10 is greater than 8/10. So 3 9/10 is greater than 3 8/10. But you won't always be able to use visuals when you're trying to compare fractions and decimals. So sometimes you're going to need to use division. Let me show you how that works. When you're trying to convert an improper fraction into a decimal, you're going to need to divide your numerator by your denominator. Now, you're going to have to make sure that your denominator is a base 10, which means 10, 100, 1,000, and that way you'll be able to divide into your place values, tenths, hundredths, thousandths, and so on. So your first step to change 38 tenths into a decimal is to rewrite your numerator. So I'm going to rewrite 38. My next step is to divide it by 10. And to do that, I'm going to look at how many zeros are in my denominator. Since I have 1 0, that's going to tell me how many place values I need to move my decimal over. So 1 0 means I move my decimal over 1 place value. And that gives me a decimal of 3 8/10. And as we can see, 3 8/10 as a decimal can be written as 3 8/10 as a fraction. Now to change our decimal into a fraction, it's pretty simple as well. We still have our whole written down, so I'm going to rewrite 3. And then we take our number that's in our place value, which is going to be 9, and put that as our numerator. And then our place value will be our denominator. So 3 9/10 as a decimal can be written as 3 9/10 as a fraction. Now I want you to notice our values didn't change. Decimals and fractions can have the same value, they're just going to be represented in different ways. Let's walk through a few practice problems together. I want you to tell me if 112 hundredths is less than, greater than, or equal to 1 1/10. All right, now you have a choice. You can change your fraction into a decimal or your decimal into a fraction so that you can compare these two numbers. To start, we're going to change our fraction into a decimal. So remember, our first step is to rewrite our numerator. So I'm going to rewrite 112. My next step is to find out what place value I need to put my decimal at. Since we're going to the hundredths place and I have 2 zeros, I need to move my decimal over 2 place values so that we end in the hundredths place. So 112 hundredths has a value as a decimal as 1 12 hundredths. So now let's compare 1 12 hundredths to 1 1/10. I'm going to line up 1 12 hundredths directly beneath 1 1/10. Now I have put a 0 as a placeholder so that my numbers are the same length. And now I'm going to start comparing with my largest place value, which is the ones place. Since both numbers have a value of 1 in the ones place, I need to move to my next place value, which is the tenths place. Since both numbers have a 1 in the tenths place, I need to move over another time to my hundredths place. And now 1 12 hundredths has a 2 in the hundredths place, which makes it the larger number. So 112 100ths is greater than 1 1/10. Let's go ahead and walk through another problem together. Is 1 60/100 less than, greater than, or equal to 1 6/10? Well, we have our choice of changing our fraction to a decimal or a decimal into a fraction. But since we already practiced changing a fraction into a decimal, let's go ahead and change our decimal into a fraction. In order to do this, we're going to keep our wholes, so I'm going to write 1 whole. And then, since I have a 6 in the tenths place, I'm going to put a 6 as my numerator and a 10 as my denominator, so that we're working with tenths. Now I have 1 60/100 and 1 6/10. Now I'm still not ready to compare these two fractions because one fraction is in tenths and the other fraction is in hundredths. So I need to find an equivalent fraction. I'm going to multiply my numerator and my denominator by 10. And that way I'll get an equivalent fraction. 6 times 10 equals 60, and 10 times 10 equals 100. So that means 1 6/10 is equal to 1 60/100. Well, that's the same fraction we're comparing it to. That means that 1 60/100 has an equal value to 1 6/10. Let's go ahead and review what you've learned in today's lesson. When you're trying to compare fractions and decimals, it's important to convert either your fraction into a decimal, so you're comparing two decimals, or your decimal into a fraction, so you're comparing two fractions. Let's begin by taking a look at the visuals that you see on the screen. We have 28/10 shaded in blue, and we have 2 wholes and 6/10 shaded in green. Now, as you can see, we have 2 wholes and 8/10 if we were to change this into a mixed number. So we have 2 wholes and 8/10. But then we'd still be comparing a fraction to a decimal. One way that you can change a fraction into a decimal when it's an improper fraction is to divide your numerator by your denominator. Now, if your denominator is a power of 10, which means 10, 100, 1000, ending in zeros, then it's pretty simple to change this into a decimal. All you have to do is rewrite your numerator, so in this case, 28. And then, since we have 1, 0, and 10, we're going to move our decimal over 1 place value. And that means that we're going to be ending this number in the tenths place, which is the same denominator that we're working with. So 28/10, written as a decimal, is 2 8/10. Now, to compare these two numbers, all we have to do is line up our decimals. So we have 2 6/10, and I'm going to rewrite 2 8/10. Our first step is to look at our largest place value. Since we have the same number in the ones place, we need to now compare our next place value over. Since we have an 8 in 2 8/10 as our tenths place, that's larger than 6, which means that 2 8/10 is the greater number. Let's go ahead and practice turning 2 6/10 into a fraction. To change a decimal into a fraction, all you have to do is keep your whole number value, so I'm going to rewrite 2 wholes, and then you have to look at the place value that your decimal's in. We're going to take our 6 and put that as a numerator, and our denominator is going to be the place value that the 6 is in, which is tenths. So 2 6/10 is the decimal, written as a fraction is 2 6/10. And then to compare these numbers, we do it just like a decimal. We first compare our whole number values. Since 2's are the same, we then move to our fractional amount. 8/10 is greater than 6/10 because our numerator is larger and our denominators are the same.